is our pleasure to welcome Dr. Rachel Zellers, who is the first visiting scholar at the Canada Service Public School between 2021 and 2022. She's a lawyer, senior research fellow, and assistant professor at St. Mary's University in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies. Her research and scholarship focus on the history of Black Canada, beginning with the American Revolution, slavery in the Maritimes, and the lives of enslaved women, and gender violence and transformative justice. C'est notre plaisir d'accueillir Dr. Rachel Zellers, qui est en fait la première académicienne visitant en fait l'école de la fonction publique du Canada. Dr. Zellers est une avocate, une chercheuse, professeur assistant à l'Université Sainte-Marie dans le département de la justice sociale et des études communautaires. Ses recherches se concentrent sur l'histoire noire du Canada, commençant en fait avec la Révolution américaine, l'esclavage dans la province des Maritimes et des femmes esclaves, ainsi que la violence basée sur les genres et la justice transformative. Dr. Zellers, up to you.
Thank you so much, Liz Martin. Thank you so much. I'm going to just do my comments in English, or we won't get much done in the time that we have. I want to just first say that I would not have been able to do anything in my role as the inaugural fellow in the Canada School of Public Service without generous and brilliant teachers like Martin Nicholas and countless other public servants that I met through through employee networks. It's really an honor to be here today. I really just have two comments in response to this presentation. The first that I have really speaks to the point of substantive equality, which, as I noticed in the chat, really does sound jargony. For many of us, this word is not something that's used every day, and it certainly is not a word that's been centered in our conversations leading the call to action over the last year and a half. But here's what it is. Substantive equality is a legal principle that refers to the achievement of true equality in outcomes. The achievement of true equality in outcomes. That's so important. And it's achieved through three primary things. The first is equal access. The second is equal opportunity. And then the third entails providing services and benefits that are responsive to the unique needs, circumstances of different groups of people from cultural groups, from social groups, different classes, but most importantly, those who have encountered historical disadvantage in very particular ways. Substantive equality is a process and an end goal. It is a process and an end goal. And in the context of data collection and analysis, which I'll give an example of in a few minutes, this means being really clear what metrics you are using for success. So I'm going to use one of Dr. Nicholas's earlier slides. Remember that slide of the three people that were standing on boxes? It's a really famous image. So imagine those three people on boxes standing there. Here's the question. Is your metric for success that everyone gets a box to stand on, or that everyone gets a box that gives them equal access to be able to see over that fence? Equal opportunity to see the game, to see what's happening on the field. And then most importantly, provides different sized boxes for those different heights of bodies, those different sized bodies. This is a really simple example, but substantive equality does this in the same way for things like race and disadvantage as well. So as Dr. Nicholas's presentation so carefully detailed, when substantive equality in outcomes does not exist, right? So if it doesn't exist in the outcomes, then inequality still remains. I saw some debate earlier in the chat about that, but it's really important, this point, that when substantive equality in the outcomes does not exist, then we know that inequality still exists. One of my teachers is a professor named Zoe Marks at Harvard, and she describes all of this in a way that I find really helpful. She says, just because things look equal does not mean that they're meeting goals for good, equitable outcomes. Just because things look equal doesn't mean that they're meeting goals for good, equitable outcomes. And she has a quote that I often use in my presentations that I'm going to demonstrate in just a minute. She says that equality in does not always mean equity out. Equality in does not always mean equity out. So here's an example. I've seen, working in different departments in data reporting, something that goes like this. Black representation increased in March of 2019 to March of 2022. It increased from this number to this number. And that surpasses public service representation, right? Black representation increased and it surpasses public service representation, right? That data on its face seems to support the argument that, substantive equality exists because that number surpasses public service representation. In fact, it really supersedes substantive equality from a data standpoint. However, here is everything that's wrong with understanding that particular data point that way. It reveals nothing about Black employees' employment levels, right? It doesn't reveal anything about where we are with employment levels, right? Where all of those, Black people who are surpassing public service representation, what jobs they're working in. Secondly, it doesn't tell us anything about how long they've been in a department. And thirdly, it totally conceals the qualitative experience. What are they experiencing? What are they living through now? So even in this sort of disaggregated reporting, one really important step was overlooked, and that is, how is success being measured here? Does that representation of Black employees actually equal the achievement of true equality in outcomes? Which leads me to Dr. Nicholas's, just invaluable research and work regarding the disproportionality index and its analysis. We know that the data claim that Black representation surpasses public service representation in a department looks very, very different when the disproportionality index is applied, which, as Dr. Nicholas showed us, provides crucial substantive information about overconcentration at the very lowest levels, right? That's what those complicated charts that he put on the screen for us represented: overconcentration at the lowest salary levels in public service, and career stagnation, and very small disproportions or disadvantage, very small representation at the top of the employment levels in public service. So to go back to that example I just gave you a moment ago, Black representation, increased in our department between May of 2020, 2019, and 2022, and that exceeds public service representation. We're doing good as a department. If I take this number, right, and I disaggregate it further, which I did actually for a department because I was pissed off at the time, I can see the exact same outcomes that Dr. Nicholas's analysis reveals, the exact same analysis and outcomes: an overconcentration at the lowest employment levels, underrepresentation at the top. So again, just because things look equal doesn't mean they're meeting goals for good and equitable outcomes. Equality in does not always mean equity out. So I just want to be very blunt in the remaining moments we have. Anything less than this kind of data analysis and application of substantive equality throughout public service is simply violence at this point in the history of public service. I want to say something briefly about qualitative substantive equality. You know, there's an old idea in public service that representative government was not always part of public service, right? In short, through the history of this nation, it wasn't always true that what is represented in Canada should be represented in public service. It only became a core staffing concept in the 60s and 70s, and as we know, only for white women, only for French Quebecers, despite the thousands of Black Canadians that lived here and the thousands of Black French-speaking Canadians that lived and worked in Canada. So maybe I'll just say one thing for the sake of time. Over the last century, we know that public service has moved mountains to open its doors for very targeted groups of white Canadians, but never for Black, racialized, and Indigenous Canadians. In fact, it's done this by using the very tools, targeted and preferential hiring practices, affirmative action, that now, very ahistorically, leaders insist would be unfair if applied in response to the call to action. Yet, without a robust application of substantive equality over the last century, the representation of white women and white French Quebecers simply would not exist as it does today in government. So here's a key question I'll leave us with for the sake of time. Will you all, moving forward as leaders, as public servants, will you continue to allow substantive equality to remain the selective domain of white Canadians, of white public servants, as it has been over the last century? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Zellers, for your powerful words. Thank you, Dr. Nicholas. Thank you, Elizabeth Martin, and thank you, Angela Cook. Folks, we learned so much today. We learned about the great work that has happened in the public service, and we learned that we all have so much more to do. We also left with some concrete actions that we can all take to advocate for racial justice for colleagues who are Black and for all systemically marginalized groups alike. Please visit this presentation on our YouTube page to revisit it. We'll have the presentation decks available on our wiki page, and we look forward to seeing you all in our next event on Tuesday on deconstructing colonial practices in the public service. Thank you for all of our presenters.
Pour répéter rapidement en français, merci à tous nos présenteurs, les personnes qui ont présenté aujourd'hui. Puis, on se revoit à notre prochain événement. Donc, merci beaucoup de nous avoir rejoints aujourd'hui.